Alright, so if you have any questions on the previous session, you can go ahead and ask those questions. If not, we will continue looking at the central repository.
Good morning, Rajesh. Sorry, Rakesh.
Yeah, Vandana, good evening, tell me.
Sorry, good evening.
Yeah.
So one quick question actually, like on the data source schema, any table structure changes, how is it going to replicate in the data store?
Sorry?
Like in the database, any HANA or ECC, like material master something, if we add a column or remove the column. So how is it going to reflect on the data store in bods?
Yeah, I'll get to that. Yeah, today we'll talk about that. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, Chandra, go ahead.
And Rakesh also have one question.
No problem.
Yeah, Rehan. Yeah.
No, Chandra, go ahead, please.
No problem. You can go ahead. I will ask later.
Okay, thank you. So Rakesh, good evening. My question is, if I have a simple Excel file for any simple report I have, so what should be the starting point to convert that file into, to bring it in a shape that I can use in my universe in BI? So can you
Oh, sorry, can you repeat your question, Rehan?
Means if I have an Excel file, that Excel report that we normally work around in Office environment, for example, any cost center report or any profit center report, any budget report, but it's all in Excel. So if I have to bring that report into my universe, definitely for the universe I have to bring it to into a database first, and then it comes to my universe. So if I have to convert it into a database, I have to work through the data services.
Yeah.
So how I have to convert that Excel into data services? Do I have to write some logics and everything?
Yeah, this is yeah. So what you need to do is, if you have any Excel source, you just put that in your inbound directory and go to your local object library, formats tab, and then select your Excel, right click, go for new, and this is where you give the file name, then the location where it is present on the desktop, right? And then you give the file name and in which worksheet your data is present. And once you provide all these things, you just need to click on import schema, and once you click on import schema, your source file will be available. So in this system there is a problem with Excel patch, so you can add it as a .txt file or .csv file. You can add it in the file formats, and once you add that, you just need to bring it to your data flow, make it as your source, create a template table, which is the database name. Yeah, this is the same process. You just need to dump it into a particular schema of your database, and then run your job so that your database tables get populated from the flat files. And once they are populated, you can create a UNV connections, and you create the database connection, then for data foundation connection, and then you import all these tables metadata into the universe, create the joins, aliases, contexts, and then you can finally refresh your universe.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if I have any problem, I'll let you know. Means I'll send you that file so I can.
Sure. Yeah.
Might need your help some.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Rakesh.
Yeah. Sorry, Chandra. Go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. My doubt is let us say HANA database, creation of instances means we need separate users, right? We need to create separate user.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we create a separate user, so we can have multiple instances in single database. Can we map those in BODS as QA and broad in data stores?
Yeah, we can do that.
But how can we do that? Because it is directly taking server name and port number, the username credentials, right?
Yeah, I'll just get back to that. Yeah.
Okay, can you show how to map your different instances with QA and productions?
So you want to you are asking, like if you go to HANA or Oracle system, you generally create a schema which is relevant to your user, right? So
Yes.
when I go to my database tables, right, if I create all these tables using data services, the default username that you see here is DBO, right, database owner,
Yes.
because the backend is MySQL. Now if you want to write your this data store to write into schema A, schema B and schema C, then what you can generally do is you go to edit options of your data store, and this is the concept of aliases which you generally create when you are creating your data store configuration. At the bottom you have something called as aliases. If you want to create an alias, right, so you, instead of it is SQL Server, it goes for DBO. Then if it is Oracle, you have to go with DS owner, or if it is HANA, then you give the schema name here to which schema you are writing to. So this concept is actually covered when we are trying to load data into, when we will see the session in which we will load the data into SAP HANA. So now you have a separate Oracle database, because the one we have is SQL and there is no concept like schemas in SQL. So if we need an Oracle or a HANA system. So we have a HANA system on this landscape. So when we load the data into SAP HANA system, we will see how I can load into different schemas using the same data store.
Okay.
Right? And the same way, when you are reading the data from multiple schemas, you can point through the same data store and read the data from multiple schemas.
Thank you, Rakesh.
Yeah. This is where you can go and create aliases. And answer to Vandana's question is, like when you create a column, right, or drop a column or change the metadata on the target table, how is that going to reflect on the database? Because in database side, if you go and look at the schemas, right, so you go and create some schema saying that create schema, schema name, or create table like table EMP, like select star from employee, right? So if I create this table, EMP will be created, right? And going forward, there will be definitely requests from the customers to add some timestamp column or a delete indicator columns to all these tables, right? The metadata can be extended, right? And if not, they will ask us to rename some columns, change the data types and all these things. So how can you address these changes in data services? So this was actually parked for performance tuning options, but yeah, since we got this question, we'll talk about it now. So we spoke about two different tables. One is your template table and the second one is your permanent table. So template table is something that we will create when we are creating, and permanent table is like we need to convert a template table into a permanent table. So even before looking into those things, how to create and how to convert that, let us look at the nature. So the template table is dropped and recreated. Right, so these template table and permanent tables are the nature of the tables on data services, but not on the database. So when you execute a job using data services to a database, a table will be created on a database, right? And data services considers these two tables in two different manners, because we will have a business demand or a business requirement which will ask us to change the column names quite often, or change the metadata quite often, or sometimes you have to delete the entire data and reload it. So there are different requirements for each and every project. So keeping all those things in mind, BODS has two sets of tables. One is your template table and the other one is your permanent table. So your permanent tables are visible under your tables list, and your template tables are visible under your template list, template tables. Now if I make, or when I create a template table, I create it from the right hand side tool palette, or I select the template tables, drag and drop it into my data flow. So two ways you can create. One, you create it from the template table tool palette, and the second one, you select the template tables, drag and drop it. So the template table, whenever you execute it or whenever you execute this data flow, this template table will be dropped and recreated, which means whenever there is a change in the metadata, column names, the order of the columns, the data types and their lengths, anything. So when you rerun this job, the existing table, let us say this table, the target table that we have is DB table stage. So this will be dropped, which means it will completely erased from the database and recreated on the go. Which means if there is any change on the source structure, new column additions and all these things will be addressed with these kind of tables, right? But all the time you will not have a similar requirement that you have to drop and recreate. Sometimes you need to go with initial loads and delta loads, which means you load a full data and on an incremental basis, on a daily basis, you keep adding data to that table. So in those cases, right, two things we need to keep in mind is, in those cases, we cannot afford for a structure change. So if there is any structure change and they are asking to keep a delta on the table, that is really bad. So you can tell customer that that is not at all possible, because they cannot keep altering the table structure and you know, expect you to maintain deltas for that, right? So that generally happens when you will go for deltas. Once your project is done, your development is done, your initial load is done, go live is done, then you will capture the deltas on that table, right? Which means your table structures, everything is finalized, and once your table structures and everything is finalized, you can, which means there will be no change in the metadata, you can select your template table, right click and import the table. Right? When you import the table moves from the template folder to your permanent folder. Right? So this is how you convert a template table into a permanent table. Now you want to call this table as a target table. You drag and drop the table into a data flow, and it will ask you whether you want to make it as a source or as a target, where you will not get this option when you are trying to drag a template table. Okay, the fundamental rule is, when you create a template table, it is your target table. When you reuse a template table, it is your source table. And you cannot create a permanent table directly. You have to create a template table. Then once your structure is finalized, you have to convert that or import that template table into a permanent table. And once you import that template table into a permanent table, again you call that back into your data flow. It will give you an option whether you want to make it as a source or as a target. Now I made this as a target, and open this one and go to the options tab. You will not have a drop and recreate, which means the structure remains standard, and all you can do is, either you want to let us say when we are creating this one, you created with some dummy data and you want to delete the entire data before loading, you can go and do this option like delete data before load, and you can load with the fresh set and uncheck this box, so that every time you run the job, it will capture those deltas and the data gets appended to this permanent table. So the key difference, template table will get dropped and recreated, permanent table will have the data appended to it, right? So this is how you differentiate between your tables, and this is you really need to take a call when you want to import that into a permanent, or till when you want to keep that as a template table. So did I answer your question, Vandana?
Yeah, thank you. So in the development, basically we maintain both the temporary and permanent. Once it's the time to go to the quality, then that's where we decide to move it.
Yeah, see, all the internal tables which are like for our reference, we don't, those are not the target tables to which we will be loading. So all these internal tables, we keep them as template because that really doesn't matter. But the final tables which we load into the target, we make sure that they are permanent tables, because there won't be any changes on the table structures, or even if there is any change coming in from the source, the jobs will fail and notify us that there is a change in the structure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So any more questions? Right, this is good. I really appreciate this. Quite interactive. Alright, so back to our topic. So we saw we spoke about this multi-user instance and how multiple people work in different environment like dev, QA, and production. And this is done in the initial days of the project as the technical team, they start interacting with the functional guys to do a requirement gathering and all these things. So based on the volume of data that you move from your source to target and number of objects that are present in your project, right, based on that you'll decide how many people are required for this job and how many developers, how many testers, how many people in your support team, and how many code promotions, how many admins. So all these things will be decided and the entire landscape will be created parallelly, so that once the technical team completes their requirement gathering, finalizes on the requirement, gets the sign off, have everything ready, and they are ready to work, so that the admin team will create this landscape, test every authorization, keep these things ready so that the development team will have the landscape ready to utilize for the project development. So for this kind of a multi-user environment, first thing we saw on day one is how to create a local repository and how to assign it to a job server and create a test job and run it, right? Now the second concept is central repository. So in central repository, as told yesterday, first we will see how to create a central repository, and the second step that we will see is how is it helpful, right? Once we create a central repository, how to use the central repository. So I'll just show it through a scenario where how to use this is by developers, QA, code promotion consultants, and third one of a bare frame of a central repository where there are no securities, nothing, just creating a bare secure central repository, and how to use that on a developer's QA and code promotion perspective, or even on an admin's perspective, right? And then again, how to upgrade that from a central repository to a secure central repository. How do you assign securities to this one? So this is again an admin role, and once we look at it, we will gradually understand what is a non-secure central repository, what is a secure central repository, what are the differences between them. Now how a developer is restricted, how a QA guy is how a developer is given a full privilege, how a QA guy is restricted, and what will be the roles of a code promotion consultant, and how will the administrator handle this central repository, right? So we will look at all these things one by one. Right, how to handle a secure central repository from an administrator's perspective. We'll look at all these things. Right, so let us see how do we create a central repository. Right, so what is a central repository? Central repository is a common storage place for all the developers in a landscape. So you can have one central repository, a minimum of one central repository per landscape. Let us say there is a project requirement that, it's a huge project that I worked with GDC Bangalore, and they have a requirement like you need to split that project. There are so many projects, so many objects in this, so they want to split this entire project into 3 streams. One is marketing, sales, and finance, right? So each stream is considered to be a project, right? There is one marketing project, one sales project, and one finance project, right? So they wanted to maintain a separate central repository per project or per stream, because this is something that looks like exaggeration, but there are 120 developers, 60 testers, 25 code promotion consultants, this is like 15 code promotion consultants and 10 administrators working on this landscape. So this is a total of 205 people on one single project. This is one of the old biggest data migration project that I worked with, and this was, I mean, as per my knowledge, yeah, this is the biggest team that I have seen and created an architecture and landscape and everything for them. Right. So in those cases, like they don't want, all 120 people to log in and log out to one single central repository because they might block some others' work as well. So they wanted to separate or keep different repositories per stream in a development environment. So you can create a minimum of one central repository, but it is always a good practice to have your development central repositories separate from your QA and your QA separate from your production. So there were some theories that you create one central repository, use it for both development and quality. There are like new theories that are coming up on the internet and all this stuff, but as an architect I really don't recommend them because you end up misplacing the jobs, or you don't have a quality version, development version, or a production version, or you need to do a lot of manual work behind that one to keep those things in place. Alright, so central repository is a common storage place for all the developers so that they can read and write the data from the central repository or to the central repository. So this is a very basic layman's definition. So to talk about this in terms of data services, central repository is a common repository for all the local repositories so that they can check in, which means add, or check out, which means read from the central repository, and where they can also maintain versions of these objects. So this is central repository. So we will execute the jobs from our local repository, but we will not execute the jobs from the central repository because central repository is just a storage. It is not a local repository where we can go and schedule your jobs or execute your jobs. So this is a definite interview question that they'll ask, can I schedule a job from central repository? And we will say no. And they will definitely ask you like, are you sure about it? Because they want to cross check if you really know it or not. So we will see in and out of this central repository because this is one of my areas of expertise when we set up the landscape. And second thing is, in my previous organization, we trained multiple batches for the certifications, and this is where we have a sure shot of 8 questions in your certification test for data services. And this is where I've been talking about this from the last 6 years or 7 years to be more precise on the central repositories and training people on this one. So let us look into this one in and out and see how the central repository is useful, right? So first step, to create a central repository. So how do you go and create that? So it is very similar to you create your local repository. It's very similar to the local repository creation, but the only difference is since you will not execute any jobs in your central repository, we will not register your central repository with a job server, or you will not tag your central repository with a job server. So it's very simple. The first step is create a database. Then second step is create a central repository using repository manager. Remember, we did this for local repository. And the third step that we did was to create a job server and assign it to your local repository, or tag your local repository to an existing job server. We will skip that step because we are not executing any jobs here. So register the central repository in central management console, and fourth step is log into designer and configure your central repository. Yes? Yes, Chandra, go ahead.
Nothing, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I thought you have a question. Right, these are the 4 steps. So if you look at the local repository creation, we have creation of a database, then creating a local repository using repository manager, tag it to a job server, register that in the CMC, and log into your designer. Right, 5 steps. But for central repository creation, it is only 4 steps. So let us go ahead and do this one. To create a database, first you need to log into your SQL Server Management Studio or Oracle database, whichever is your backend database, or in case if you are using SAP HANA as your backend database, you need to go and connect to that one.
Rakesh?
Yep.
Rakesh, do you have HANA SAP HANA database?
Yeah, on this system, yes. I'll show it to you.
Can you go with HANA?
No, we have a separate session on that one. Let's not get deviated because we created local repositories on this one. So let us continue this landscape, and on HANA we will see a different scenario. I'll get to that one, Chandra.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry for not doing it right now, but it goes through a plan. So probably once we get into that stage, it will be more clear for you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So to create a database, so select your databases, right click and create db underscore cr11 or cr underscore development, so which says that this is my development central repository. So just give the name and click on OK, and if there is no conflict, yeah, there is a conflict, I guess. So I am giving the name as db underscore cr underscore dev1. Right, so your database is created. At the bottom of the list, you expand it, and the same story, you'll see the empty tables. Right, on the HANA side, what you will do, you will go and write a statement saying that, okay, so it just, so on the HANA side, what you will have is you'll have a single database, and you'll go and create one second. I think it is not right. Administrators, or just let me go to this folder. So this is something like a workspace that we need to create and utilize so that all our work will be saved there. Right, once we log into the HANA system, so here it is like you go and tag to, in SQL Server you go and tag to one server name, and under that server name you can create DB1, DB2, DB3 and so on. But on Oracle and HANA they have a similarity that there will be one database. A master password has been created now. Alright, so on the HANA side, what you'll have is you'll have a master database, in-memory database, on which you can go and create schemas. Right, so what you will do, you'll select this one, the system, go to the SQL, and here you will go and create a schema like create schema GMA. Right, so I'll go and create a schema 1 called as Rakesh, and this is where I execute this one. Cannot, okay, Rakesh 1 is already present. Alright, so go and execute this, and this will create a, alright, so it's created successfully, and you go to your catalog and Rakesh 1. Alright, just let me refresh this one time. Alright, so this is my schema. Now, when I create a central repository on top of this, I'll be using this schema name, right? The HANA database credentials will be the HDB system. Right, you go to the properties and you'll see, right, so BWERP will be the host name and all these things. So you need to pass on these credentials, right, when you create this database, and especially you'll be using that database name, and on top of that you will be using the schema name, right. So that is how you use HANA as a backend database or HANA as a backend database for your local or central repositories, right. So let us go ahead and create with whatever we have. So I created a database. The second step is to create a repository. So the navigation is Start, All Programs, Data Services 4.2, and you go to your repository manager. So I'll try to show both the things parallelly. So if it is HANA, then you have to use the version, and then you have to give the BWERP HANA, that is the HANA server name, then port, username and password, right? And you click on create, it will go and create on top of that database. Now,
yeah, here directly we are giving database server name and port number, username and password.
Yeah.
But we are not able to giving the schema name, right?
Username is nothing but a schema name, right? On Oracle and HANA. So you create a user Rakesh, which is nothing but you are creating a schema or a space for him to work on. That is a work area.
No, that's okay. I have 3 schemas for 3 different environments. Shall I create it for that?
So you have 3 different environments, means you have one schema for development, one schema for QA, and one schema for production. Then definitely yes, you will have a username with that schema name so that you have full authorization on that schema. Because now I created or I connected to this HANA system using a super user called as system, right? But if I log in with, so this is nothing but once you create the schema, it is you go and say create Samuel identified by Samuel, which means you are creating a username with the same password, right? So that is how you create usernames and passwords. Or you go to securities and create a user and call the same user and create a schema with that name, right? So the same way, you're getting my point, Chandra. So if you are having a development schema, you'll have, if it is BODS or DB_dev, you'll have the same username and password. If a schema in Oracle or SAP HANA is nothing but a username, right? Every username will be the same as your schema name. So which means you are giving them a space to work on the system, right? So that is what we pass in our data services screen. Right, since in our case it is Microsoft SQL Server, I'll give the server name, then the database name is db_cr_dev1, if I'm not wrong. Right, yeah, this is the database name, db_cr_dev1. So I'll pass the database name and then pass the username and password. So once you give all these credentials, the same step that we did for local repository, first click on get version to make sure that there is no database that is, or no central repository which is built on top of this database. Chandra, can you go on mute if you don't have any questions?
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries here, please. Yeah. So if you don't have any central repository created, this is the message that you should see on the system. And if you see this, then it is a go ahead for us to go and create a central repository. So just make sure that you select central and then click on create. So there is something called as enable security. We'll talk about that a little later. So go ahead and create your central repository. So with this, your step 2 will be completed. Creating central repository, which means it is adding all the repository level information to the backend tables, AL tables that will be created in the database. Once you create this, right, you'll see all the AL tables, and this is the final message that you'll get. The central repository is successfully created. Click on get version. You will see a non-secure central repository is created because we haven't enabled security yet. So to show the difference, we will first work on a non-secure central repository and then convert that into a secure central repository. So step 2 is completed. Now register that in the central management console. We are skipping the job server part because we will not be able to execute any jobs on the central repository on the central repository. So I'll be skipping that part, job server mapping. So go to start all programs, SAP Business Intelligence platform and central management console. This opens with a web page. This is where we registered our local repository to. So if you are directly working on the server, you will see something called as localhost. So this is an Oracle term for the server, or generally the system term for the server. Right, pass on your username. And password and click on login, and once you log into the system, you will see data services in 3 different areas. One is in the drop down. This is sorted in alphabetical order. You can go and click on this one, or you can click on data services on this one, or search on this toolbar for a similar icon like this and click on that. The easiest way is click on this drop down or click on data services directly. And this is where we go and click on this button, configure a new data services repository to register our repository. So CR development is the name of the central repository that I'm giving, and you can give any description, development central repo for the stream sales, or you can give any kind of this thing. Now the backend database is SQL Server. Then the database server name is BOIDS, and the database name is db_cr_dev1. These port numbers, they will remain same, so do not change them. Pass on the username and password, and once you do all these things, just click on test connection. Successfully connected to the repository. Click on save. There is a name that is already existing, drdev1. Okay, now you go to your refreshed central repository, and you should be in a position to see the name of your newly added central repository, CRDev1. It is a non-secure central repository, and if you want to do some changes, double click on that, do changes on the description, but you will not be able to do any changes on the name once it is done and saved. Right, so you can change the database, you can change the server, everything, but you cannot change the name of your repository. Right, so now we are done with the step 3. Right, now next log into your designer and configure your central repository. So go to your data services designer, right, and close all. Right, just to avoid confusion, it is not mandatory to close all. So once you log into your data services designer, go to tools, and in the tools you'll have something called as central repositories. Click on that, and before adding any central repository, this is the shortcut icon for your central repository, which is grayed out, which means nothing is configured, so that is the reason why it is grayed out. And once we configure the central repository, this will be activated. So select the central repository and click on add. Log in with your username and password. Alright, so CRDev1, and just cross verify your description, development central repository for sales. Select that one. It doesn't have, you see a difference here. So this one has a lock symbol on it, and this one is not with the lock symbol, which means this is a non-secure central repository which is open to all, and this is a secure central repository. It has some restrictions on this. We'll get to that a little later. So this is a non-secure central repository. Select that and click on OK, and you need to pass the database password, and this is added, which is secure is no. So once you add your central repository, you need to activate that. which means you can add multiple central repositories to your window, but you can activate only one at a time and you can work only with one at a time. Because this is a quite common question that will be asked in your interviews, or even most of the students ask me that, you know, can I configure more than one central repository? Like as per the example you said, you have central repositories for sales, marketing and finance. So can I have three of them active at the same time? So absolutely not. You cannot, because if you are in one stream, you can work only on one stream, and you can add all those three like this. You can add one more, right? SCR dev. Okay, I don't know why. Okay, let me select other one. Crazy. Alright, so I can add multiple repositories here, but I can activate only one, right? And if I have to activate the other one, I have to go and deactivate the previous one and then only activate the other one. So this is a trick, right? So once you activated your central repository, this icon is activated and you click on this, and this exactly looks like your local repository, isn't it? Right, you compare each and everything, whatever you have in your local. You have projects tab, you have projects tab, you have jobs tab, you have a jobs tab, and functions tab, the last one, you have functions tab here. So why is it exactly like your local? Because whatever you create as a part of your local repository, or whatever the objects that you create and work on should be added to the central repository. So that is the reason why it exactly looks like your local repository, right? So this is how we create a central repository, right? This is an administrator's part, right? How do you create a central repository? Though it is a non-secure central repository as of now, but this is how you create a central repository and configure that in your local repository so that people can use the same one. I can log into any number of local repositories and I can configure or connect to the same central repository. Right, any questions on this before we proceed to the next topic? How to use the central repository? Alright, so second thing is how to work with the central repository. So now we have done the first step, which is creation of this, and will link to our local repository. The same way you can log in from multiple local repositories and connect to the same central repository. The second one is how do you work? So let us see how we will work as a developer, then we will see how I work as a tester, then we will learn first how I work as an administrator, and then how I work as a code promotion consultant. Right. So in the beginning of the projects, right, so generally once we start the projects, we spoke about this non-data disclosure agreements, NDA documents that we need to sign with the customer. So not everybody in the project will be signing it. The leads and the architects will be signing it. And once they sign that document, they will go and create those data stores in their local repository and add it to the central repository. Now, as an admin, the first step, when you add your data stores, right, it might not just be limited to the data stores. So administrator can download some pre-built templates like BPDMs into his local, cleanse everything, work on it, and then upload it into the central so that everybody can use it, right? So it is not just limited to anything, right? It is not just limited to your data stores. It can be your jobs, projects, workflows, data flows, anything can be added to the central repository. Now, if you are adding it to the central repository, right, this can be a developer's role, not a tester's role, but developer's role and code promotion consultants, they add from local to central, right? So this is what we are trying to do. Admins, developers, and code promotion guys. right? So just referring back to the window, admin will create and add some authorizing objects like data stores. Local developers will create and add their jobs. Code promotion will get the latest and add it to the central repository. All these three will do the same steps, right, when you are adding to the central repository. Now, when I select a data store, so you cannot add it from a project area. So you select a job, right click and see you cannot add it from a project area. You can add only from your local object library. Let it be your projects. You get an option add to central repository. Let it be your job. You get an option to add it to the central repository, or let it be your data store. You get an option to add it to your central repository, right? When I am adding an object, let it be a job, data store, or project. That's the reason why I'm mentioning that to be an object. When you are adding an object to the central repository, this gives you three options. One is your object, the second one is object independent, and the third one is with filtering. So what does that mean? So I have three different data stores here. Let me add it one by one in each data store with a different option, so that we can go and see what is exactly happening when I'm selecting objects, objects independence, and with filtering. Now, the first one is I'll select with object. So what is an object and what is a dependent? So here, if you look at this one, this data store is an object, and all the tables that are present under this data store are its dependents. Now, when I am adding this to the central repository, only the object, now only the data store will be added. Added on 12.9 and right, so this is very important, because if you don't give any description, you cannot go and look at the history. Probably you can see version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but why these versions are maintained, you will have no idea. So this is the most important thing: added by whom, added for what purpose, and added as how. So these things has to be maintained. If you are working on any jobs and your jobs are like have some issues, you worked on that and fixed that one, or if there is a change request on your job, you worked on your job, worked on that CR, enhanced your job with that CR. Now when you add your job back to the central repository, you'll say CR 1000 completed and uploaded testing. It is just like you just give a comment saying that why you are doing this load into the central repository, so that somebody who will look at this one can really understand which is the first version, which is the next version, and what is the difference between these two. Alright, so just click on continue, and now the object is added successfully. Now you go to your data store tab of your central repository, expand. You will not see any tables because you added only the object. Right, now the second thing, so how to get the tables into that one, we'll get to that a little later. The second thing is adding both objects and dependents, right? So now this should get my data store along with alright. Now you see an additional thing saying that apply comments to all objects, which means the main object and also the dependent objects. If you don't check this box for each and every table that is present or each and every object that is present under this data store, you have to give an additional comment, right? So select this one, which means the same comment will be applied to all these dependent objects as well. Click on continue. The second data store is added. Now you go and expand. You'll see the tables that are present in this one, right? So this is another scenario in which you will add these objects to the central repository. The third scenario is you want to add your job to the central repository, but there are few test tables that you created as a part of your development which you don't want to move to the QA environment, because you just want your code to move, but you don't want some of the objects of your code to be excluded. So that is where we go with an option called as add to central repository with filtering. Now here it will show that this is the data store. It does not exist in the central repository. You want to create it or exclude it. So I want to create this data store. Next, go to the tables. You have Mara table. It is not present. You want to create yes. There is Marcy table. It is not present. You want to create. You can say exclude. So this is with filter. You can go and say which job, which table, which data flow, which data store you want to create or we want to upload to your central repository, and which we want to exclude. So this is where we do a filtering option, and click on this one, add it with filter. Right, you can give some information like this. Click on continue. Now go and expand your SAP data store and you should be able to see Mara but not Marcy, because we filtered it out. So these are the three options in which you can add anything, not only the data store but anything from your local object library to the central object library, where you can add objects, dependents, and with filters. Right, so I will add this job with objects and dependents. Now this says these data stores and tables are already present in the central repository. The same version is present, so it is not going to update. Click on continue and add it with dependents. Continue. Now what are the dependents of this job? This job has data flows. Right, this is the job. You go to the data flows, expand the data flows. It has all these data flows in the job, so all of them are created. So Marcy table is a part of this job. Now Marcy is created because you added this job with its dependents, though you excluded that in the beginning, but now you added this job with its dependents. So that is the reason why it is added. Right, so if you are using any flat files as a part of your job, those will also be added to your central repository. Now this is how.
Okay.
Yeah, Chandra.
Actually, it's a hierarchical procedure, right? The projects, jobs, data workflows, data flows, data source, and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Can we add one highest level to central repository? Then the dividends all will be added, right?
Exactly. Yes, true.
Then what is the highest level?
Project.
Project. If you add the
is,
project,
yeah.
then everything.
So if I add a project, all the jobs, everything related, data flows, workflows, flat files, data stores, tables, everything will be added to the central repository.
Okay, thank you.
But generally we will not do that, because as administrator I'll create the data stores and add it to the central repository so that my team can work on it. And as a developer I just want to add only my job into the central repository, so that it is not a one-man army that happens in the project. There will be multiple people who want to upload their jobs. So now let us say I added this project, right, and there is another person who also had the same name and is trying to have a same job name. For example, he just had an initial version of my job in his local repository, and so let us say we both are working on a project. So initially when I created a test frame job, I gave my job to you, and you also have the same job, but that is very initial version. And after that I created all my job, I completed that one, and without adding the job I added this entire project to the central repository with objects and dependents. My job is also added. Now you also go and add this one, so your job which is present, which is initial version, will go and overwrite my job in the central repository. Right? So to avoid these kind of confusions, what we generally recommend is, as an architect, we will ask the developers to push their code only, which means their jobs. If they are working on a particular job, we will ask them only to push their job into the central repository. And second most important thing that we will generally tell them is add with filter and exclude the data stores. Right, so because the previous versions, they will overwrite the data store every time they write into the central repository. So now let us say I have a data store with development configurations, and somebody was doing a testing on the data stores with test configurations. Now they write it back into the central repository. They will override those data stores. But from the version 4.0, you can actually control that one, right? So that is a major technical change that is done on the central repository between 3x and 4x, right? You can actually in the old version 3x, you literally have to go and keep your data stores locked, right? You have to do a checkout so that nobody can overwrite it. But in the latest version, nobody can overwrite it unless and until they have a full authorization on that, and they are doing it on purpose. Okay. Yeah. So it depends, Chandra. Sometimes when you are the only person on the project and you have everything built on your local and you just want to load at the top level so that everything gets pushed, you can do that. Or you are a developer and there are other developers too and you just want to add your code, you can select that and right click and add to the central repository. Right. So once your job is, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, no problem. I will ask at the end of the time.
No, you can. Go ahead. No worries.
This is normally data we are exporting data to central repository, right?
Exporting your jobs to the central repository.
Central repository. Now, how can we retrieve it from central repository?
We'll get to that in a bit.
Okay.
Okay. Now, let us say I have this job added to the central repository. Now I want to do some changes on this job. Right. So there is a change request on this job to add something else, and I want to do those changes and add it back to the central repository. Now, just let me tag this to the right hand side for a convenient screen. Right. Now I want to do some changes and add it back to the central repository. You select the job after your changes. Sorry. Right click, and you cannot add it to the central repository. Right. So unless and until you do a check-in and check-out to make sure that your right version of code is maintained, you cannot directly load that into the central repository. Just give me a second, guys. Yeah. So you cannot directly, every time add an object to the central repository. Initially, you can add an object, and I will also encourage you to learn the right terminology, like when we are reading and writing from the central repository, instead of saying that words, when you talk to the customers or when you talk in your interviews, if you use the right terminology, like adding object to the central repository, check in, check out, so that will make a meaningful statement, or that will make a good impression when we are in front of customers or when we are in front of an interview panel, right? So once you added your object to the central repository, if you want to do a change on your job, so this is the developer role. Now let us say they ask me to delete this, or they ask me to add one more thing to this one. Right. Now you want to write it back into the central repository. Right. There are two steps in doing this one. The actual process is, first you need to if you have a change request, or once your code is added to the CR and you want to modify that code and upload to the central repository again, the first step that you need to do is like check out from central repository, which means whatever the latest version of the code that is present in the central repository will go and overwrite your code in the local repository. So this is a newly added thing, right? So let me save this, right? Just to prove how this checkout works. So I'll select my job and do a checkout. And again, in checkout, there are multiple options. I'll just talk about that in a bit. So I'll do checkout with replacement, objects and dependents with replacement. This will not include the data stores. So that's the warning message you got. Your checkout is done. Now go back to your project. Open your job. Check out the first conditional. So whatever we have done earlier saved is gone, because whenever you do a checkout, this will engage your central and local repositories, right? These two will be engaged with this check mark, and all the objects and dependents like your tables, your data flows, whatever you use in that job will be checked out, and it will also override with whatever the latest version that is present in your central repository that will overwrite your local repository. So as per the process, what you need to do is like do a checkout, do the changes in your local repository, save your job in the local repository, then go to the central repository and check in. So remember, db_db_ext is the new data flow that we have added. So you have to go with objects and dependents. Yes. Let us say this is change request 100, 1000, continue. Now once this is done, go to your central object library, go to the data flows, and you will see this is newly pushed from your local to central. Now, to show what is present in central, so this is a question, Chandra's question. So to show what is latest in the central, right? So I removed this one and again saved it. So this is your answer, Chandra. So if I want to get something from the central without doing a check-in and check-out, if I just want to read something from the central, this can be the tester's role, code promotion consultant roles, or the developer's role. What we generally do is select from the central repository, get latest version with objects and dependents. Right, when I do a get latest version, there are two versions that are present in central repository. One is my previous job, which is not having this data flow, and the second one is the job which is having this data flow. To go and look at the previous version, select your job in the central repository, right click, and there is an option called show history. I'll talk about all these things, but just giving a heads up on how it works. So you have two versions maintained. One is added with dependents. The second one is with central change request 1000. Now you go and click on this one. This is a version without this database, right? Without this data flow. I click on get by version. Your get by version is done. Now go and open your job and cross check. Right, your database or database to database data flow is missing, which means your central repository can maintain multiple versions, but it will just show you only one tagline outside the job name. But if you go and really want to look at the history, you can go and look at the history of the objects. Like you can maintain multiple versions. You can also maintain the labels, which we'll be looking in tomorrow's session. There is a lot about the central repository. It is kind of a very vast subject, but it is very interesting as well. So now from local to central, we have seen these options like add to central with 3 different options. The next thing we will see is from central to local, right? So we saw how a checkout works, right? a basic checkout, I'm not talking about these options, a basic checkout, how it will override the content in your local repository, which means the same version has to be maintained from your central in your local so that you can work on the changes and add those changes to the central. But there is always a case of human error where, let us say I worked on this job so hard, I completed it, and I sent it to my quality system. The tester did some testing on that, and he will raise a issue or a defect ticket saying that there is some, the data is not matching as per his expectations. Then I'll really be upset, like I did a lot of effort on this job, why it did not run? And generally the human tendency is we'll go into that particular data flow or anywhere where we need to do the changes, and then we will end up doing the changes. Right, let us say I have to add this field, I missed it, and the tester identified this and raised a ticket. Then what I will do, without going as per the process, like without going for a checkout, then do the changes in the local and then check in, what I will do as a general human error, I will go to my job to first see if it is really missing or the tester is faking it up. So then I'll go and add this or change the business rule, and then I'll validate and run and see everything. Then I will realize that I haven't done a checkout. If I'm not doing a checkout, which means whenever I do a checkout, all the changes in my local repository will be gone, right? So in tomorrow's session, we will see how do we avoid such kind of human errors, or if you have done something like that, how can you still do a checkout without losing your changes in your local repository, all right? So we'll see there's further complex options of central repository in tomorrow's session. Okay, right guys, thanks for joining today's session. We'll connect again tomorrow.